Welcome, everyone, to the Introduction to Workflow in Windows Applications talk. I'd like to introduce myself, Bill Devlin, Group Program Manager for Windows Workflow Foundation. And thank you. Have some friends out there. That's always good. And my esteemed colleague, Paul Andrew, Technical Product Manager, Windows Workflow Foundation. I was going to ask how you felt about the announcements this morning, but I guess that applause kind of gives me my answer. Hopefully everybody caught the announcements this morning, but in case anybody didn't, I'm very proud and excited to announce that we're bringing workflow to the Windows platform, Windows Workflow Foundation. Also very proud to hear that Office is building on top of this and building rich solutions. And really what Paul and I would like to talk to you about today is talk to you about how you build solutions as well on top of this platform. So this is the first of 6 breakout sessions on Windows Workflow Foundation. So we'll be going through some of the basics, some key concepts. We're going to show you some demos on how to author simple workflows. Some of you may have seen Don Box and Dharma Shukla writing up some workflows in Don's talk earlier on. Well, you don't have to be Don Box to write a workflow. You could be, but we'll show you different authoring styles and show you how to build workflows. We'll also talk about this key concept of activities, show you how to build custom activities to extend the model for your scenarios. We're going to go in a little bit under the hood as well later on in the talk and show you how some of the stuff works internally. And in the end, we have a more scenario-based demo we're going to show you. And I think we're going to take questions at the end. So, Windows Workflow Foundation, this is the workflow framework and tools for Microsoft products, but also for all the products that you folks build. Partner solutions, customer solutions. We really want to address the entire workflow ecosystem as we think about it with this technology. And there's 3 things that I'd like to highlight kind of as introductory words about the technology, 3 key points. The first one is this is a single workflow technology for Windows, so we are basing our future workflow investments in all the product lines on this technology. You heard about the investments that Office is making. We'll also talk about BizTalk a little bit in this talk. And you may have heard from Mike Ehrenberg just before this about how MBS is building on top of it as well. And we really are trying to span the entire workflow spectrum with this, both what we call human and system workflow. And there was some discussion about that in the keynote this morning. But we really think workflow is everywhere, and there's a broad spectrum of scenarios we can address. So we've really had that as a key design point. The second major point is that this is a framework. It's a programming framework. It's not a server or an end-user application. It's a framework on which you can build those things. So that's why we're included or exposed through WinFX. This is a core set of APIs that will be a part of Windows through WinFX and will allow anybody to build workflow into their Windows application. And then the last point is really, this is really part of it. It's been our dream for quite a while building this technology that we felt that workflow was such a key component of any software development system, but it was a shame that it just wasn't available to the vast majority of developers. So there are certainly workflow systems out there, and we will have partners that will build and extend on top of the engine we create. But there really was a void there in .NET, if you will. And Bill mentioned this in his keynote yesterday, that we've done a lot of work in up-leveling the system, service model, etc. But there was really something missing, and we think that workflow is one of those missing pieces. So we'd like to transform workflow from what it is today into a mainstream .NET developer paradigm. Now, to do that, of course, we need all of you. We need you to build solutions, and we're really excited that we think we've got a terrific framework for you all to build on top of.
Bill, I have a message from the admin. Apparently, if anyone's sitting on the floor and they're uncomfortable, there is overflow room 511A if you want to go and watch us on film.
Thank you, Paul. We also have some room in front if people would like to come down in front and sit on the floor. More the merrier. Okay, so let's talk about, well, what is a workflow? I think probably most of you have an idea of what we're talking about when we say workflow, but I wanted to give you a real basic definition of what we mean when we talk about a workflow. So really we think about a workflow as a set of activities that coordinate people and software, or people or software and software. It's all about coordination. And this notion of an activity is really think about it as the building blocks of workflow. We'll talk about that quite a bit. Here's two examples of activities. The first one, escalate to manager, would be an activity that would be common in a human workflow scenario. Check inventory could be a web service where I'm using workflow with service orientation to build a line of business system by composing services with workflow. So these activities are they're organized into some sort of workflow, or think of it as control flow. And we support a number of different paradigms for control flow. We'll talk about that in this talk. But you could think of it as a flow chart. You could think of it as a state diagram like that, and those would all be correct. So I mentioned earlier in the talk that we were really trying to address a very broad spectrum of scenarios here. And I wanted to go through this before we really got into the code so you could understand our design points and understand how we're really trying to position this technology. So human workflow, well, that's involves humans, as you would expect. And the control flow tends to be more ad hoc, less prescriptive. They deal with documents versus structured data. System workflow is the term we use to describe software talking to software. And that feels much more structured. It often feels like a protocol. It's important there that the software adheres to the protocol because software is generally not that flexible in dealing with different protocols. And the data tends to be more transactional or structured. So we're really trying to address this entire spectrum. Let me give you some examples of types of solutions. Again, these are just examples, but types of solutions that we have within Microsoft, but also you folks have as well. We heard about Office this morning, information worker. This is very document-oriented scenarios in Office. So routing documents between users, approval, escalation, really leveraging the core concepts that people are already familiar with in Office, but stringing those together in workflows. Another example could be something that's more BizTalk-centric, a business-to-business communication protocol for a supply chain, for example. That may be a good example of a system workflow where I have, say, web services communicating with each other, coordinated or orchestrated by a workflow. But in fact, most scenarios that we've studied have a mixture of both of these types. And in fact, line of business applications, if you heard Mike's talk, they're a mixture of human and system workflow. In fact, Mike describes workflow as connecting people with software. So people is a first-order thought in there. IT management, lots of workflow scenarios. Provisioning, that's something that automating provisioning steps, a key scenario. Managing trouble tickets, a lot of long-running workflows involving people and software. And then the last one I wanted to point out is really just more of a horizontal category of just broad development using the existing paradigms that we already ship in .NET, Pages, Services, ASP.NET. We're going to integrate workflow with all those things. So, for example, in the future, you'll be able to define page flow using this workflow technology, i.e. the flow of pages in my application. Instead of embedding logic directly in those pages, you'll be able to define the flow separate from the pages to make it easier to develop and maintain. As well, service coordination. We have a very rich model for building services, for exposing those services to the outside world. And workflow can play a key role in coordinating those services. In fact, I can even build a service as a workflow. And there will be a breakout session that will talk about that. I'll go through the breakouts at the end, but there's an exciting session on that tomorrow. So why do I need workflow technology in the first place? Those are all important scenarios, but why do I need some special technology to be able to do it? Well, it's really all about developer productivity, making you folks more productive. So Bill talked about up-leveling the system, and he gave a perspective on what we've done over the years with Windows. And this is another example of up-leveling the Windows platform to make the abstractions that we offer more powerful. One of the ways that I think about this is that, in a sense, that a lot of what we do as software developers is trying to make software mirror the way the real world behaves. And what I mean by that is building systems that work the way people behave and is natural for them and powerful for them, not building systems that are natural for computers necessarily, but building systems that are more, people are empowered to use it because it fits the way they work. And so this is an example of a programming paradigm that if you need to build a workflow, you've got a workflow problem in your business, we have an abstraction that directly applies to that. So let's drill into that a little bit. So specifically, how do we add value? How do we make developers' lives easier? And there's three things that I want to highlight here, and you'll see some examples of these things through the talk. The first one is long-running and stateful behavior. The next one, flexible control flow, so flexibility. And the third one, transparency. So let me drill into these and give examples to highlight what I mean. So in the real world, an order management system might have characteristics like I describe on this slide. For example, I could make a statement about my order management system might be, orders are confirmed in 48 hours and shipped within 30 days. So if I have an order workflow, that means my order workflow has to run, or it has to live for a very long time, at least in computer time scales. And this is one thing that the Windows Workflow Foundation framework provides for you automatically. It allows workflows to live for a very long time, so you don't have to deal with the persistence problems that are required to solve that problem. The second example of a real-world statement or scenario would be that most of our suppliers confirm our orders, but sometimes they forget and we need to follow up manually with them. Well, that's an example. If I just coded the steps in my order workflow as just a set of imperative statements in code, I may have the flexibility to express this exception handling scenario where sometimes orders don't arrive and I need to follow up and resolve them manually. So flexible control flow is something we provide to allow you to build systems whereby users could skip around steps if they need to, and you can expose that functionality to them, or override steps in the workflow. The last one, what are the next steps in handling this order? Very common question. Where is this order at? What's the status? So this is an example of what we mean by transparency. And you could imagine an order management system that rendered some rich visualization of the workflow involved in processing those orders and showed you where you are right now, how you got there, and what's going to happen next. Well, in order to do that, you need to have the transparency to know how that workflow was defined. Essentially, that visualization would need to be data-driven, using the workflow definition as data. So having that transparency to look at the control flow of your workflow is something that's really key to what we're offering and difficult to do with traditional code, which tends to be opaque once you build it. So transparency post-deployment at runtime is something we think is a real key value add. Actually, we'll see examples of all these things as we go through the demos. One question I've got asked this morning a few times, and some of you may have, well, how does this relate to BizTalk server? So let me give you some real simple way to think about that. BizTalk is a premium BPM server. It's a distinct server product that you buy, install, and manage on its own. It's used in some key scenarios, B2B, EAI, BPM. And it focuses on deployable solutions that you can use out of the box. And it has all the manageability and scale-out attributes that you would expect from a premium server. So I like to contrast that with Windows Workflow Foundation, which is a programming framework, a set of DLLs, something to build on top of, exposed through WinFX. So this is not a standalone server. It's something you could use to build a server. And again, since it's not a standalone server, it's something that you would use to build manageability and scale-out attributes into your application or server. Okay? And then the last thing I wanted to say, that in the future version of BizTalk, we'll in fact use this technology for orchestration scenarios. And this is really a theme that you're going to hear about with BizTalk as it becomes based more and more on WinFX technologies. There is a version of BizTalk in the pipeline right now, BizTalk 2005, that is an incremental release. But beyond that, you can expect to see a lot more alignment with our premium server products building on these core technologies like Windows Workflow Foundation. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing and why we're doing it and how to think about it. I'd like to now introduce a couple key concepts that will help you understand how to build workflows and take you through a lot of the other talks. So very simply, workflows are a set of activities. Activities is an abstraction that we define that is used for all the constructs within a workflow. Workflows run within what we call a host process. And what this is your application or your server. So this morning, Steven Snofsky talked about workflows in Office and how SharePoint was playing a key role there. In fact, SharePoint will be a host process for Windows Workflow Foundation. So that's an example of a server really hosting Windows Workflow Foundation. Activities, that's a core concept, and there's a lot. They represent the constructs that we offer out of the box, but as well, it's an extensible framework, and you can build custom activities. We're going to talk a lot about that in this session, and there's also a session right after this that's going to go even further. This is really a key part of the programming model and gives a lot of power to you. I'd like to really contrast that with another approach we could have taken here. We could have decided, well, let's create a workflow language and make that kind of a language with a grammar, but that would have been kind of an approach to workflow which really had a fixed language. And what we're trying to really do here is build a framework that's extensible. So the language, if you will, or the model which you use to build workflows is extensible, and you can build in the constructs that are natural for your particular problem domain or your application. So people that are constructing workflows within the context of your application have natural things to work with when they string together workflows. Okay, so what are the pieces we provide in Windows Workflow Foundation? Well, there's three key pieces. Base activity library. I talked about activities being the building blocks of workflow and all of the constructs, so we have a library of activities we ship out of the box. Those activities are managed at runtime by a runtime engine that provides a lot of the long-running behavior that you get for free when you use our activities or when you write your own. And then lastly, because we're hosted in any application or server, we created some architectural plug points to plug in essentially resource providers. For example, the runtime engine automatically will persist workflows as they run, such that they can be persisted when they're idle and no longer consume resources, survive system reboots, and then come back to life later on when what they're waiting for actually arrives. In order to do that, there's a persistence service that's required, and we provide one based on SQL out of the box. But if you have special needs and want to persist those workflows in your own store or in a special way, you can plug in a service that takes over that persistence. And we'll actually drill into this a little bit more later in the talk when we see how workflows execute. And then last but not least, we have a fabulous Visual Studio hosted designer. You saw a little bit of that this morning, and we'll be showing you more of that in this talk. Okay, so more basics. As you would expect, a workflow is a class. And here in this sample of VB code here, we see that I've created a workflow by defining a class called myWorkflow. And I've derived from one of our out-of-the-box activities, something that we ship in the base activity library called sequential workflow. Okay? And I would program this, much as you would expect to program, say, WinForms and controls. You could think about an analogy there between the workflow being the form and the activities being the controls that I compose in. Workflow could also be defined in markup. And we'll talk about markup a little bit after the first demo. But really one of the key themes here is that this markup is really an object serialization, much like is used in Windows Presentation Foundation. And so I can author in code, but I can also author in markup. And because of the way those two are tied together, there's a consistent experience between authoring in markup and authoring in code. The last thing I wanted to highlight about workflows before we kind of get into a demo is that the workflow constructor really plays the key role here in defining the structure of the workflow. So we talked about activities being the building blocks. What the constructor of a workflow class does is build up the set of activities that comprise this workflow. So this is actually one of the ways in which you can provide transparency, because once we've built one of these workflow classes, we have a constructor that's going to build up this tree of objects that represents the structure. And we can reflect on that at any time after the workflow is built and see what is the control flow, what are the sets of activities that make up this workflow. In this example here, you actually see a workflow being constructed with one activity in it, a delay activity. So essentially the constructor calls this method called initialize component. You'll see two partial classes used here. I showed it to you that way because that's the way you see it in the Visual Studio Designer. But essentially the constructor ends up calling this method, which news up an object, sets some properties, and adds it to the collection of activities for this workflow. And that's the basic structure of a workflow and how it's defined. With that, I'd like to hand off to Paul to show us a demo of how to build a simple workflow.
Thanks, Bill. So for this first demo, I'm going to show you Visual Studio 2005. I'll switch over to my screen. And I'm running Visual Studio 2005 Beta 2 with Windows Workflow Foundation Beta 1 installed. You all got this in your goods disk, DVD 4. It's also available for folks to download off MSDN at msdn.microsoft.com/workflow. That's our site. So in this first demo, I'm going to walk you through creating a simple workflow. I'm going to create a workflow that pops up a dialog and says, "Hello, Paul." Okay, so let's go ahead. First off, we create a new project. And in the new project dialog, you can see this additional folder for workflow where I have 6 new Visual Studio templates. This is available for Visual Basic and also for C#. I'm going to go and create a sequential workflow console application. And what this gives me is 2 template files. One, module1.vb, has a simple console application that allows me to create a workflow. And 2, the workflow file itself, workflow1.vb. So this is the workflow designer, and this is a sequential workflow. And over in the toolbox, you can see a number of activities which I can use to construct my workflow. I'll grab one of these activities, and as you'd expect, I can drag and drop that into my workflow. This is a code activity. A code activity allows you to write some code beside or a code handler so that you can drop down into .NET code straight away. It's got this smart tag here, which is something we use in workflow to tell you that, hey, this activity is not completely configured. And that's done by an activity validator. This one's telling me that the property execute code is not set. And this is helpful because it means I see what I've got to do next without having to go compile and see what errors are going to come up. Execute code, of course, is just the code that I'm going to write for this activity. So when I double click on code 1, a handler is created for me, code1_execute code, and I can type my code. Message box, hello, Paul. Okay, so let's extend this simple scenario a little bit more. And I'm going to add to my workflow a condition to check whether or not it is Paul that we're saying hello to. So you don't want to say hello, Paul, if someone else is running it. It's a little bit simplistic, but it allows me to add a little bit more to this workflow. So I'm going to go in and add a member variable into my class. And I'll just set that to Paul so that I'm going to assume that it's always me. When we go back into the designer, I can add on the if-else activity, which can test my condition. And the if-else activity has 2 branches. The first branch is going to have a condition on it, and if the condition is true, we execute the activities contained in that branch. The second branch is the else activity. So if the condition of the first one isn't true, we go down there. Okay, so I've got my little smart tag, and I'll go in and set a condition. There are 2 ways that you can create conditions. You can write them in code and return a Boolean, or you can create them in as a condition expression, which I'm going to show you. I'll call the condition check name. And here's the rule condition editor, which is a simple condition editor which I can create composites of predicates doing various comparisons and logical operators. We have additional rule support in Windows Workflow Foundation as part of the policy activity, which is a subject of one of the later talks. Okay, so I'm going to test here. My name is Paul. All right, now that I've got my if-else, I'll drag my code into the first branch. And I want to set up that second branch so that it says hello if I'm not Paul. What I thought I'd do at this point is show you how you can actually write the code to create the activities rather than just using the designer. Now, in our Visual Basic editor, the code for constructing the form is in the partial class, which is hidden by default. So I'll go in here and use show all files, and then I can see the second part of the partial class, workflow1.designer.vb. This is the code that is being created by the designer as I edit it. You can also use the workflow markup format where this would be XML. Our designer supports both mechanisms. So in here, I want to go in and add a second code activity. Here you can see my initial code activity. It's of type system.workflow.activities.code. And I'll just create a copy of that and call it code 2. To add that activity into my workflow, I need to create an instance of it. And also, I need to set some properties here. And finally, you can see these other activities being added. I'm going to add this activity into my if-else branch 2. So I'm just going to grab this existing line. Bill's pointed out I missed the comment. Sorry about that.
Next line.
Oh, no.
That wasn't part of the script, was it, Paul,
No.
that you were going to show the
I do need some more smart tags, though.
Ah,
Let me do this last line. So we're going to add into the second branch. This is why we have a designer, I think. Okay, so we should be able to now, if I've got all this right, switch back to the design view, and because the designer executes directly on the code, it's updated straight away. All right. All right, all right. It's not like I actually got it right. Okay, so you can see there's a smart tag come up on my second code activity. Of course, that's because I didn't add the handler in code. That probably would have taken me another minute or so. So I'll just double-click on that, and that'll add the code beside the handler for that second activity. And we'll say, hello, not Paul. Okay, so now we've finished the workflow, a very simple workflow, and I can run it. Before I run it, I want to show you my module 1. Now, Bill showed this, in the module 1, this is the template of a console application that you can use to get your workflow going. It's not what we expect people to use as a production host application, but it's very handy for debugging and getting going. You can see my main here. It starts off by creating a new instance of workflow runtime and then calling start runtime on that. That gets our runtime going and allows us to set some things up. Next, I'm creating an instance of the type of my workflow. You can see that's called workflow 1. And I'm passing that type to the workflow runtime using start workflow. Start workflow will create an instance of the workflow, and from that point, the workflow runtime manages the execution context and the state of that workflow. You can also see a few lines here related to me waiting in the console application until the workflow has completed and then stopping the runtime. Okay, so here's our workflow in the designer, and I'll run this workflow now. First of all, I'll set a breakpoint here in the workflow. We have a complete debugger built for debugging workflows as an adjunct to debugging C# or VB.NET code. So I can add a breakpoint here and run and compile. And here we are running in the debugger, and you can see that it stopped at my breakpoint. The workflow started, and the yellow box is indicating the activity that it's stopped on. We also have a call stack and everything else that you would expect with a .NET debugger. So I can step through my workflow now. We step into the first branch, and then it's going to test that branch It finds that it's true. It goes into my code activity. You can see my call stack is progressing down. And now when I step, we actually step through into the code handler, the code beside, and it's going to pop up my message box for me. So there you go. That's how easy it is. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you, Paul. So Paul showed you how to author a workflow in Visual Studio, and he showed you what the code looks like that's generated by the Visual Studio designer. But there's actually several ways to author workflow. We mentioned earlier that workflow can be authored in markup, i.e. XML, and we use the term kind of declarative authoring to represent this. So that's very useful if your workflow doesn't require any new code. For example, in the example that Paul showed, he used a workflow with activities, but he added some code in the code beside style by adding a handler or implementing a handler that code activity exposed. Well, if you don't have any code that you need to add to the workflow and it's just the activities, maybe some data flow between the activities, configuration of those things, if that's your entire workflow, you can author it in XML. In fact, you could invoke our compiler, so you could generate the XML and you can manage it as XML and then compile it at some later point. In fact, that's actually a methodology that Office uses for deploying workflows to SharePoint. So you could kind of deploy and compile at first usage is a really powerful way to think about these things. But in general, what Paul showed you is that workflows are built into an assembly, and that's done at design time. So whichever way you author, at the end of the day, you end up with an assembly, with an object, with a constructor that defines the activities in that workflow. I wanted to highlight one other point here is that we do make it easy for people to build their own design experiences around workflow. So if Visual Studio is not an appropriate design experience for people that are going to build on top of your solutions, then you can write your own tool, just like as you saw this morning with FrontPage. The FrontPage team has built a kind of a rules, conditions style, dialogue-based workflow authoring tool. That's going to generate workflows, just as Paul did here. So you can construct your own authoring environments that are appropriate to your application or solution. One thing I also wanted to note, you may have noticed on this slide that I didn't use the term XML, I used the term XAML or XAML. And you've probably heard about XAML in the context of Windows Presentation Foundation. So you may ask yourself, well, what does this have to do with presentation tags? Well, XAML certainly contains a lot of tags specific to Windows Presentation Foundation. But at its essence, what it is a serialization of objects. And that gives us that consistent authoring experience between code and XML that you have in Windows Presentation Foundation. And we use that same approach in Windows Workflow Foundation for defining workflows. So workflows, as you see, that's a bunch of classes. We serialize those, and we use the same methodology for serializing them as Windows Presentation Foundation does. So again, this is another point of consistency that in WinFX, where this XAML is going to be XAML approach is going to be used in a way that spans WinFX, isn't specific to Windows Presentation Foundation. Okay. So now let's talk about activities in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned before, these are the building blocks of workflow, and they're also the unit of execution, reuse, and composition. I'll show you a little bit of execution logic under the hood, and you'll see how workflows execute, and you'll see that it's all about executing activities. Reuse and composition you'll actually see coming up in Paul's next demo, where I can actually derive off someone else's activity, or I can compose a bunch of activities together and encapsulate them in my own activity. So as I mentioned, we really want developers like yourselves to build custom activities that are specific to your problem space. And there's some very powerful ways that you can do that, and ways that you're used to with .NET and just dealing with classes. In addition to being a class, of course, they have properties and events. And this is the way, as an activity author, that you expose programmability to people using your activities. So workflows that use your activities. They can set properties, and those properties can come from other activities in the workflow. That's what we call data flow, workflow. But also events, and you saw an example of that in the code handler that Paul implemented. That's an extensibility mechanism that we offered to you when we built the code activity. We said you can plug in a handler and so give us a piece of code and we'll execute it. But as well, it's got some activities have some differences than classes that you may have used in the past. There are methods that we manage and we execute within the runtime engine. So for example, a key component of building an activity is coding what we call an execute method, and that's really the body of the workflow when it, or sorry, of the activity when it runs. And that's not something that you invoke in your code, but we invoke in the workflow runtime. And again, we'll see a little bit of that when we go under the hood. This is kind of what a simple activity might look like that sends some email. And as you would expect, activity is a class. And here in the sendMail class, again, we have a constructor. And you'll see there that execute method that I pointed out, that where this is you provide the body of logic that you have in your activity. Okay. You also notice that activity has properties. In this case, I have defined one string property, subject, and this is exposed to people that use my activity. And that's pretty much all there is. That's the basics. But in addition to that, there's a lot of built-in stuff that we provide, both ways for you to extend our model in different ways, but also built-in behavior. The first example here is these set of companion classes. So in addition to defining the behavior of an activity when it executes at runtime, I can define how an activity appears in the design surface. So you saw the look and feel of activities when they're used in Visual Studio out of the box. You can completely override that and provide a class that essentially implements a draw method that draws the activity in whatever fashion you prefer. And that's done by coding what we call a companion class to the activity class. Another example of a companion class that would be fairly common to use would be something we call a validator. So an activity that's a composite activity that contains other things, like a sequence. You may have some logic where you want to restrict the types of activities that can be included within that parent activity. That's logic that you could put in a validator companion class, and we will run those validations at design time and build time to enforce those semantics. So those are two examples there. Behaviors. Two key examples, transactions and exception handling. And in the base activity framework that we include out of the box, there's built-in support for atomic transactions and exception handling, where what I can do is I can define, say, the transactional behavior if a transaction aborts. I can define what to do in that case in an exception handler coded as a workflow. Right? So I don't have to code low-level transaction semantics or acquire my own transactional context, any of that stuff. We can provide that automatically when you use that type of behavior. And you'll see an example of that in the next demo. With that, so let's bring up Paul again to show us a demo building activity.
All right. Thanks, Bill. For this second demo, I'm going to show you what Bill's just been talking about and build an activity. I have an existing project here, so I'm going to specifically go in and build an activity. And the scenario for this project is a banking debit credit application. The scenario is I have a savings account and I have a checking account, and I want to move some money or transfer it from the savings account to the checking account. Okay, so I already have an activity here for debiting the amount from my savings account. What I want to do is add an activity that credits the amount into my check account. So I'll right-click on the project and choose Add New Item. And you can see we have some additional templates for files that you can add to your projects, as you'd expect. And I'm going to choose an activity and call this activity Credit Amount. Okay, so when we add this into the project, it defaults to having a composite activity which you can build out of other activities and as a sequential. I want to build this activity in code, so I'm going to go into the properties and change the base class from sequence over to activity. Also, while I'm using the designer, and the designer can edit the code for me, I'll go in and add some properties to this activity so that those properties can be wired up to variables in the workflow. So let's add in an amount. And a database connection string. Okay, now having done that, I want to create the rest of this activity in code. So I'll right-click on the credit amount activity and view the code for it. So here's the code for my activity. You can see some code has been added already by the designer when I created those two properties. I'll scroll down past that because what I want to do is add that execute method that Bill talked about earlier and in order to add the code to my activity. I have a shortcut for that. Here's the execute method, which by default returns status.close, indicating that the activity has finished all of the work that it needs to do. Now, in this activity, all I'm going to do is move some money from my savings account to my checking account, so I'm just doing a database update. And I have some code for that too. So here's my one-line database update. I'm using the Microsoft Data Access application blocks from our Patterns and Practices group, and otherwise known as SQL Helper. I'm using execute non-query, passing in that I'm calling a stored procedure called credit amount, and I'm passing in that property that we created, so this dot amount. Okay. At this point, I can build my activity, and that's really all I need in the activity. So I'll switch over to my pre-created workflow, balance transfer workflow. And in this workflow, I'm going to add the activity and execute it inside a transaction. The first thing you'll notice is that there are already some activities here. I'll just briefly describe what these do. This workflow is going to be called from a Windows Forms application. So the workflow will be hosted, the workflow runtime will be hosted in that Windows Forms app. And when we execute the workflow in that Forms app, first off, the workflow is going to send some informational text, it's going to grab the current amounts in the two databases, and it's going to stop and wait for instruction on how much money to transfer between the two accounts. Okay, so all of that's wrapped up in sequence 1. I'll just collapse that up. It also does a couple of things with the Forms app after we've done our transfer. You can see that my two activities from the activity project have been added into the toolbox. And this happens automatically if you have an activity project in the same solution as your workflow. It happens as soon as you first compile the activity. If you don't have them in the same project, you can add activities quite easily also. I'm going to use a transaction context, which is a simple activity that can contain activities operating on resource dispensers or doing other types of transactions. We'll choose an atomic transaction so that we have potential for rolling back should we have a failure. First off, I'll grab my credit amount activity and we'll credit some money into the savings account. You'll notice a slight delay as I drag the credit amount activity into that project. That's because under the hood, the designer was adding a reference to my activities into my project for me. You can also see down here my two properties, my amount and my connection string. I'm going to wire those up to variables which are part of the workflow. I'll add in the other activity also. So now we can run the Forms application that executes our workflow. And the Forms application lets me start this workflow. And remember, there were those few activities that executed before we did the transfer. So now the workflow is executing and it's waiting for me to send it an event to tell it how much money to transfer. I have $1,000 in each account. Let's move $100 from savings to checking. That's pretty straightforward. And we see the updated balances, $1,100 and $900. Okay, I'll run a second workflow. And just to check out whether this database transaction is working, let's try and move $20,000 from savings to checking. Remembering we're crediting the checking account first. And I run the transfer. This time, the transaction is aborted, and you can see our resulting values, 1,100 and 900 are back. So it's really easy to create activities, and like Bill said, we hope you guys will build lots and lots of them in your workflow development.
Great, thanks, Paul. Okay, so really what we're trying to establish here is this community of building activities on top of this framework we provide. So we provide these out-of-box activities in addition to the framework, provide general purpose type of functionality, but really we want you to build custom activities that either extend or compose or just author brand new activities from scratch. And our ultimate dream here is that really there'll be a whole ecosystem of domain-specific workflow packages out there that are built around this framework, on top of the framework, specific to whatever vertical or horizontal application you happen to be concerned with. Okay, so now let's go under the hood a little bit and drop down a level of detail and talk about what was really happening when a workflow was running, as Paul showed earlier on. I'm going to refer here to the three-layer stack that I showed earlier on that Windows Workflow Foundation is comprised of, the base activity library, the runtime engine, the runtime services, and show you how they interact in a very simple example. We're going to go through 3 phases of workflow execution here. In the first phase, we're going to actually just create the instance of the workflow. Then we're going to be executing that workflow until it becomes idle and it's got nothing more to do, or it's waiting for something, essentially. And then we'll show how it gets persisted to disk such that it can be unloaded from memory if that event that it's waiting for occurs a day from now or a week from now. So the first step in this is that my host application is going to call runtime.startWorkflow and pass in the type of the workflow that I want to create an instance of. This really ends up being a call into our runtime engine, into a subcomponent that we would talk about as the instance manager. It's responsible for managing the lifetime of workflows. And what it's going to do next is it's going to load the type. So it's going to go to the DLL that we built, the workflow, and load up the type. And we're going to create an instance. And what this workflow looks like, it's very simple, kind of contrived example, but to show you how things work. Workflow 1 consists of a sequence. Within that sequence, there are 2 activities. The first activity waits for an event to occur, event 1, and the second activity is going to invoke a method once that event occurs. Okay? So the first thing that happens here as we're getting ready to execute is that the first activity is enqueued with the scheduler component that exists within the runtime engine. So this is the piece of software that manages the execution of activities. So there's something new here I introduced. I introduced the notion that the workflow itself is an activity. Well, that's actually true. In fact, the workflow, as well as being a container for the activities or the control flow, it really is just an activity itself as far as the runtime engine is concerned. So the first thing that a workflow needs to do is execute that first activity, execute the workflow. Okay, so now we have an instance. Let's walk through what happens when it executes. First thing that's going to happen is the scheduler is going to dequeue the next thing to do, and in this case, the top of the stack is workflow 1. And as you saw, every activity has this executor or execute method. So as you might expect, workflow 1, since it's an activity, derives from activity, has an execute method. But this is actually something we implement for you because my workflow, in this case, inherited from sequential workflow. So we'll end up calling the execute method that's provided for you automatically in the base activity library. And what that method's going to do is it's going to enqueue the next activity to execute, which in this case is the sequence. So now we'll have the sequence on the queue. And then now it starts getting a little bit recursive as we dequeue the sequence and take a guess what the sequence executor does. Again, this is something that's provided in our base activity library. But this is going to enqueue the first actual activity in the sequence. So now we have on event 1 in the scheduler's queue. And then when we execute that, what's end up happening here is that that activity is going to end up subscribing to an event that it's waiting for. So in this case, it's waiting for something external to happen. And once we take that step, the workflow is now idle. So even though the workflow is not complete, it's waiting for something, and that may take a long time to occur. So at this interval, the runtime engine can arrange to persist that instance to disk, such the workflow could run for a very long time. So the instance manager notices that the queue of work for this workflow is empty, and then it calls another method that's in this base activity library, in fact, in the activity class itself that we implement called save, that knows how to serialize activities and essentially creates a binary serialization of the workflow and creates a stream. And that stream is handed off to one of these runtime services. I mentioned at the beginning this persistent service. The job of the persistent service is to take this stream of persisted data, so it's the runtime's execution state, what's it waiting for, it's the current state of all the member variables that we have, it's everything that you need to know in order to bring that workflow back to life when event 1 actually does arrive. And so the persistent service will take that stream and save it out, in this case, to some store. And now we have workflow 1 sitting on disk waiting for event 1 to occur. So that gives you kind of a rough sense of what's happening under the hood. The cool thing is you don't really need to understand very much of this in order to build workflows, because this is all provided for you automatically. You need to know how to build activities, workflows, and how to start them. And then this is what happens basically under the covers. So let's talk about the richness of the base activity library that we ship out of the box. And again, we have, as you would expect, we're trying to span this spectrum of human and system workflow. We have activities that are designed specifically for those types of tasks. The workflows that you've seen so far are what we call sequential workflows. But we have a paradigm built around state machines. And I'll talk about these a little bit more in the next slide. But the idea behind that is a workflow that's driven by external events and modeled as a state machine like you might draw in a Visio diagram instead of a flowchart, sequential flowchart. We also have rules capability in this base activity library. And you saw a very simple example of that in the first demo that Paul did, where he created what we call a declarative condition. You remember that he tested a property of the workflow to decide which branch to take in order to which person to greet. The way he expressed that condition, remember he mentioned you could define that condition in code, but you could also define it the way he did as a declarative rule. And that's actually pretty powerful because those rules, again, become part of the workflow model, and you have visibility into those rules at runtime. And in fact, those things can be changed at runtime if needed. So if you have a requirement for building a lot of agility into your solutions, where giving people the power to change rules on the fly, that's one way you can do it. Of course, sequential control, you saw some examples of those things, sequences, if then else, and you saw transactions as well. There's also a very important piece underneath that that we call communications, and there's really two styles of communications. And I can communicate with objects that are running within my application, i.e. in proc, if you will, and I can get events from them, or I can invoke methods. And of course, the other way, as you would expect, is web services. And there is a talk that's going to drill into that, as there are talks that are drilling into state machine and rules coming up today and tomorrow. This is all built upon what we call activity framework. And you saw some of the machinery under the hood in the last slide. But this is stuff we provide for you, all the base classes, the built-in behaviors around transactions, exception handling. And then I mentioned, or I alluded to just briefly, this concept of dynamic update. One of the key features of the system is that if you decide to expose it, you can allow workflows to be modified while they're executing. Why would you want to do that? Well, an example might be that you want to offer end users the ability to add in steps on the fly, or an ad hoc scenario. For example, let's say at a certain point in the workflow, I want to allow users to add in a step that initiates a collaboration or adds in an escalation step. I don't have to build in all those control flow paths a priori into the workflow. I could simply offer a palette of those activities, and then at runtime, based on the user selection, your application could add those activities to the workflow, as long as we're at a point we haven't already gone past. So that's, again, something that hits at this notion of flexibility and flexible control flow. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Sequential workflow, well, you've seen this, and it's pretty easy to understand. In fact, really the sequence of operation here is exactly the sequence as you code in the designer. The order of activities in the sequence activity defines the order in which you'll execute. And those activities will always execute in that order. Even if I have activities that are waiting for external events, those events will actually be processed in the order in which they're defined in the sequential activity, regardless of the order in which they arrive. So it's a very prescriptive way of defining a workflow, appropriate for formal scenarios where adherence to a particular prescriptive ordering is really important. And the way to think about this kind of as a metaphor in your mind is as a flow chart. We have this additional style called state machine workflows. And these are more reactive to the outside world. So the order of processing here is based on the order in which events arrive. So think about this as really a collection of event handlers, if you will. And we use the metaphor of a state machine to present that to you through the activity library, and as you'll see in a little bit, in the designer. Suitability for this type of workflow would be where you really need that reactive, external-driven behavior versus a prescriptive order. And this is also a very convenient model to handle things like skip and rework. So if I want to skip around a state, and the event that would trigger that state I know is not going to occur, I could just skip around it. I don't have to wait for that event to occur. I could just have the next event or the next logical step take place. If I want to go back, I could have an event I received last time or last week. I could have that event come back in, so I can go back. That's useful in things like where maybe I change an order after it's been confirmed, and I need to go back and reconfirm it. Common pattern in business processes. State machine is designed around those patterns. It's also rendered in the visual designer as something that looks like a Visio diagram, or the way that you might draw up a business process if you're drawing bubbles for the states and arrows for the transitions. So it's possibly a more natural way for if you're collaborating on development with people that are defining the business problem, maybe a common language for you to view the workflow. And then the last piece is rules-driven activities. So the ways to think about this is rules are really data-driven, and they react to data. As opposed to reacting to external events or communication coming in, they react to changes in data. And there's a number of different styles of rules activity. We have a drill-in session on this, but just let me give you an overview. The simplest is the declarative conditions that Paul showed earlier. We also have something called a policy, which is a set of conditions that are evaluated as a unit to produce some sort of answer. An example of that might be loan approval criteria. I may have a complex set of rules that are defined that look at the various parameters of the applicant, the amount, etc., and those are all executed together to produce an answer. Is a person approved for this loan at this step in the workflow? So I can define all those rules together and wrap them up in a policy activity and use that as a building block in workflow. We also have a construct called constrained activity group. And what this is it's a set of activities where for each activity there's a rule associated with it. And when that rule evaluates to true, that activity will execute. So it's a little bit like a state machine in a sense, but essentially the transitions are not defined explicitly. They're defined implicitly via rules. And again, it's a very flexible paradigm, and one that you can learn about in the rules session later on today. Lastly, I want to come back to this concept of transparency. So I mentioned earlier on that one of the really useful things about workflows is that you can look at the control flow. You can look at the activities that are defined for that workflow after you've built them, after deployment. There are a couple ways to do this. One is we provide a set of APIs where you can actually go to the runtime and say, give me a workflow instance representing this particular workflow and identifying it. And then you have essentially a class which you can use to call methods which look at the status of the workflow. This is also a way you could invoke a dynamic update, is I can actually make some changes to that instance and commit those changes. So this is really what we would call a pull model. If I've got some logic and I know that I need to look at the status of a workflow at a particular point in time, there are APIs you can call to do that. The other way to do it is more of a push model, and this is what we call tracking. And so built into the runtime is the capability that as workflows execute, the runtime will emit events, we call tracking events. And you can supply a service that subscribes to those events and persist that data out into whatever store you choose. So if you want to monitor workflows as they're running, this is a great way to do it. If you want to gather statistics about workflow, such that you can look at the performance of your order application, of your order processes in aggregate every month and do analytics on that, this would be a great way to gather that type of data. Tracking is also very useful when I'm not exactly sure what data I want to track when I built the workflow. So I don't have to define that up front when I build the workflow. I can just build the workflow the way you've seen here, and then at some point after it's deployed, define what we call a tracking profile. And that's a set of metadata that instructs the runtime engine exactly what track points to emit out in the event stream that it exposes to the tracking service. So I can change the metrics that I gather and the level of tracking, post-deployment. So with that, I want to show you have Paul show you one final demo. And I'd like you to watch out for a couple things in this demo. I've talked about flexibility, flexible control flow as one key thing that we offer. Watch out for something that kind of looks like flexible control flow. Also, I talked about transparency, the ability to look at the control flow, look at the workflow definition post-deployment. Watch out for some of that too. You'll see some examples of that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Paul.
Okay. So before we get to flexible control flow or transparency, this demo is going to be of a state machine workflow, and this demo is designed a little bit more to show you what's possible using Windows Workflow Foundation. So you can see a state machine here in my designer. The lines here represent our set state activity of changing between different states, and you can see these events which are occurring inside of the workflows. You can also add additional control flow inside these, but what I'd like to show you is Fabricam Incorporated. This is a sample application which you may have seen earlier in the day, which uses Windows Workflow Foundation and Windows Presentation Foundation and Windows Communication Foundation. You'll never guess which one of those I'm going to focus on. So we're going to have a look at that same state machine and how it helps us with processing of a quote request for Fabricam Incorporated, who for this scenario are a manufacturer of projectors. Okay, so we have a menu here over on the left, and I can open up my Rolodex with my list of my account managers. And a particular account manager has requested that we create a quote for a projector. So let's go in and create a new request for quote. I don't have to type all of these things in. I can just click on this button here. And then we can select the product that we're requesting the quote for. LCD rear projection sounds like a good idea. We can submit this quote into the system, wait till it goes away. And then we can go in and manage the quotes that we have. Here you can see my quote for Paul Andrew down the bottom. And I'll just move this down to the bottom. If I click on this quote, we can actually watch the workflow for the quote request in operation. So you can see here the same workflow that we looked at in Visual Studio, but it's got these different colors representing the current state, which is this blue one, previous states that we've been in, which is this green color, and states that we haven't entered yet, which is this black color. So you can see my quote verification is completed. I'm in quote review right now. And this has sent out a couple of emails, one to engineering and one to finance. So I'll bring up my Outlook Express. And we have 3 emails here. The first one is just telling the company that someone's requested a quote. The second one is from engineering, and I'll just go ahead and approve that. If you're quick, you can see the state flashing as the tracking information is being updated, and we're monitoring that. And let's say that finance didn't like that, so we'll go and reject that. You can see the state machine being updated, and we're kind of done with that quote. We didn't get that one through at all. Okay, so let's have another one. I'll just move this out of the way. I'll create a new quote so that you can see what success looks like. And this time, let's quote on a cell phone projector. I hear they're all the rage these days. Alright, so we've submitted our additional quote, and you can see that's been added to my list down here. I'll click on that so that we can bring it up in the workflow view. And just carefully drag that across. So now you can see this quote has got to the same point, and it must have sent us those 2 emails. So let's grab those up in Outlook Express, and I'll approve both of those. You can see the event which is firing flashing in the event in the state there. And then we've gone through to the management approval state. So if I refresh my email again, there's a request for the sales manager to review the quote. Well, the sales manager is the person who started this off, so they have access to this other tool, and they can go ahead and accept or reject there. Alternatively, they can request some additional collaboration on this quote. And if you watch the state diagram over here carefully, when I collaborate, you'll see that we're actually modifying a workflow that is running on the workflow engine. We've added a state in here, and we've changed the current state to that state whilst this workflow is executing. So that was one of the 2 things you were supposed to be watching for. And, okay, just to go ahead, this collaboration is with someone who has a very simple programming technique. Here's their collaborative application. And so I'll just put in the GUID of the workflow there. You can improve on this, this in the future. And we'll say that that review is complete. And this will use Windows Communication Foundation to send the message back to my workflow. So there it is, and we've got down my quote process is completed, and I'm done.
Very nice. Thank you, Paul. So you saw some transparency there at runtime, rendering the visual view. In fact, that was what we call rehosting the same design view that we use in our Visual Studio Designer. If you were really listening carefully to Eric Rudder this morning, he mentioned that in his keynote. But of course, you could look at the definition of the workflow and render whatever view you wanted at runtime that was appropriate for your users. And another example of flexibility of the dynamic update, adding that step. Okay, so let's wrap up. So Windows Workflow Foundation. This is an extensible framework and tools for building workflow into your applications. Single workflow technology. Framework to build upon, not a server, not an end-user application. Key features, enables you to build long-running stateful workflow into any application. Extensible activity framework, that's kind of a call to action for you to build activities specific to your problem domain. Flexible control flow, transparency, Visual Designer, WinFX, Office 12. Okay, so we'd love for you to learn more about this technology. We'd love it even more if you use it in your applications, building workflow into your apps, building workflow-enabled servers, systems, building custom activity libraries, or just leveraging workflow through other workflow-enabled systems like Office 12. We've got several, hold the applause, we've got several more sessions here. We talked a lot about, in this session, about the things in blue here, the basics. Right after this, in this room, is a drill-in into custom activity authoring, more detail behind what you saw in the second demo. Right after that, in a different room, there's a session on the rules-driven functionality that I described. Getting into tomorrow, there's a session on Office workflows, if you really want to build on what Office 12 is providing in SharePoint. We have a drill-in session on state machines, a lot of detail there. This is a session on web services and workflow. Don Box, Dharmashuka will be giving that talk. And lastly, if you want to know all the details about how do I host Windows Workflow Foundation and deal with communications, there's a talk wrapping up on Thursday. So with that, lots of hands-on labs, more community stuff. Okay, thank you.